Hello, and welcome to the Gang Culture Podcast, a series educating you about gang culture. This season, we hope to expand on the lived experiences of gang and street life, explore further research surrounding the appeal of gangs, all while bringing together an array of unique voices to inspire, empower, and cause change. Whether you are listening at home, school, or on the way to work, we hope you enjoy and learn something that can be shared with others. Hello, listeners. Welcome back to Gang Culture. This is season 2, and I'm your host, Ellis Rouse. And today we have a special guest, a professor and educator at the University of Delaware, Dr. Cresean Hughes. Today we'll focus on school environments promoting gangs, influence of social media, rappers on youth joining gangs, and Cresean Hughes, your work and how it intersects with gang culture. So Cresean, welcome.
Glad to be here.
Dr. Hughes. Question for you.
All right.
So if you can, just introduce yourself a little more and tell us a little about what you do.
Absolutely. So happy to be here. As you mentioned, my name is Cresean Hughes. I have been at the University of Delaware now for 8 years. I got my PhD at Florida State University in 2017 in criminology. And I primarily study youth outcomes, particularly in school settings, particularly interested in how kids are punished, how school punishment happens, to whom it happens to, and sort of what are the kind of short-term and long-term consequences of that punishment. And so I'm looking forward to this conversation because I do think it dovetails really nicely with some of the work I do.
Awesome. Thank you for joining us. Off camera, we did speak a lot about the classroom setting. I am an outreach coordinator or specialist, and I do social and emotional behavior and learning, and just using certain formats in the classroom, how it can get kids to open up a little more. So I would like to expand on that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because your experience in the classroom, what has it been like with students?
So it has been interesting, certainly in the wake of the pandemic. We're at a point now where the senior class at UD is the senior class that was that were high school seniors at the time that the pandemic started. And so my experience has been a situation where we often see students who are really, really uncomfortable sharing, really uncomfortable asking questions, answering questions. I don't want to play armchair psychologist too much, but it seems as though there's just a general fear around maybe not saying the right thing, maybe just being vulnerable in front of friends and classmates. And so the notion that the work that you do is I can certainly see its benefits or the need for it, given what I've been seeing certainly kind of post-COVID in my classroom. So absolutely a huge part of what I think is happening, not just with younger kids, but also even some young adults as well.
Yeah, it's been, since COVID, it's been a challenge to have young people open up and express their feelings. I have a question. So, in your opinion, what is the impact of social media, news outlets, musicians, rappers, and the attraction of youth joining gangs?
Okay. So, I think there are a number of things at play, and the attractiveness of gang membership. It can take a number of different forms. So I think it's important to start with the environments that many gangs often arise in. Many of these places are significantly disadvantaged, and that disadvantage can look a number of different ways. It could be racial and economic segregation, where you have your poor citizens who are essentially confined to very poor areas where there aren't a lot of resources, limited access to kind of basic necessities. And so I think it's against that backdrop that the attractiveness of gang membership sort of arises. And so I don't think we can talk about it in a vacuum. So I do think what happens is, whether it's social media, music, oftentimes those things may tap into something that kids are already experiencing on the ground, whether it's having to navigate violent environments in their neighborhood, whether it's having to navigate a not the greatest school environment. Here, we're located here in Wilmington. I often hear fairly consistently in cities not far from here, Baltimore, Philadelphia, where students are all they can't the maybe the air conditioning isn't working in the summer, or the heat is not working in the winter, and so it's against this backdrop that students or it's in these environments that students find themselves, and as a result, I believe, are looking for status, looking for acceptance, looking for family and belonging, and they're not often finding it in some of these places. And so gang membership often becomes attractive because it opens doors that feel closed to a lot of these kids, particularly in really tough environments. So I would say, I think it's hard to disentangle the neighborhood and the community from what's happening with the kids within that community. But I do think it's against that backdrop that social media, that music, any other influence can kind of fill that vacuum left by the absence of resources, a difficult home life, just the general inequity in a disadvantaged neighborhood, and so I think that's where those things really become important.
Yeah. I've had my experience with the music industry. Good friend of mine, Busta Rhymes and Rick Ross, and I've always felt that if I could find a way in the music industry, if we could find a way to push a conscious effort of music, because it just felt one-sided.
Right.
And although I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, in a tough neighborhood, and I do understand the struggles, I do feel like there is another side to the story,
Absolutely.
And if it could be told,
Right.
So I have another question for you. Have you ever experienced any gang activity in your life?
So I grew up in a really small town in Mississippi. So not maybe a town of about 12,000 people. So not a huge place. And the neighborhood that I did grow up in, it wasn't the greatest neighborhood, but it wasn't some of what we think of when we think of the most disadvantaged or the places with the most inequality. So my general experience growing up, at least as it relates to gangs, was pretty tangential. Like it was sort of it was a thing that I knew happened. It was a thing that you might see at school every now and then, or maybe something from the neighborhood spill over into the school, or something from the school spill over into the neighborhood. But broadly speaking, I was pretty my mom, my dad, my grandparents kept me pretty much on the straight. but I was aware that was happening around me. I probably couldn't say to what extent and maybe how much, because I was in church a lot. I was in a lot of after school activities. And when I wasn't doing those things, and if I wasn't out with family somewhere or friends, I was probably at home. So I was certainly aware of it, but in terms of really impacting me in a significant way, I can't say that was a part of my personal story.
It's interesting that you mentioned you were in church,
Mm-hmm.
and I feel like my mom having me involved in church helped me in my activities
Right.
as a young
Absolutely.
person. Even when I was amongst the gangs,
Mm-hmm.
I was able to have a belief system,
Right.
and it helped salvage.
Yeah. There we talk in many of my classes, we talk a lot belief in just kind of conventional values and conventional norms can play a big role in, if not completely protecting you, still giving you sort of a home base to sort of to come back to. And so, yeah, I absolutely would agree with that and identify with that. It even at, when things are wrong, if there's not enough money for the light bill, or things are a little, that there's some struggling happening. uh in a very similar way, have often found kind of faith to be something of a you know a source of support to kind of hold on to. And I do think that certainly when it's something that, at least for me, you kind of start at an early age, it's something that you don't really don't really ever lose, um, even as you get a little older. So absolutely.
Yeah, and to add on to that, since COVID,
Hmm.
I noticed, obviously when businesses were struggling, um, we were not able to
Hmm.
gather.
Hmm.
Churches were
Right.
affected.
Right.
So, what do you see as a option
Hmm.
for youth or families that would like to be back in the church,
Yeah.
or just don't know?
Right. So I think church, organized religion is at an interesting kind of point in history. I think for the last, don't know the number off the top of my head, but maybe the last 10 to 15 years, kind of church membership, church attendance has been declining in a lot of places, and kind of across the country broadly. And so I think there are a number of reasons for that. I My guess is that in many instances, um, the church doesn't always feel safe, doesn't always feel as the church purports itself to be. And in that regard, I think some people have sort of made the decisions, whether it's parents, or whether it's kids as they get a little older and have a little more autonomy, is that they're not always seeing the church in the way that it often expresses itself to be, or often hopes to be. Um, and so in absence of that, I look at the work that's being done in a place like this. I mean, we talked a little bit before, you know, things just kind of keeping kids busy and keeping kids in supervised spaces, that can make all of the difference. Now, that certainly could be church, but it also could, it could look very different. It could be after school program. It could be being a part of the high school band, or playing a sport, whatever the case may be. But I do think there is a value. This is something that we see in criminological theory as well, that there's a value in kind of pro-social involvement. Now, for some people, that could be the church. For some people, it could be, you know, campus organization. If we're on a college campus, it could be at in a high school, one of those school organizations. Anything that is pouring in a positive way can certainly, I think, serve as a sort of protective factor, even if it's not the church in the way that I experienced it growing up.
Yeah, I do. Believe that after school programming is vital. Currently working as a community outreach specialist. It's like you mentioned, it's kind of like a church for our youth. We're able to discuss many things.
Absolutely.
And just not be a part of things that are negative. Just having a positive environment.
Right. Absolutely.
Going back to the music.
Okay.
Are there any songs or movies or shows that come to mind that may have more influence on gang involvement or interest?
So I'll speak personally. I'm a fan of The Wire. I think it's one of the, if not the greatest show, TV show that's been made. But I don't know how accessible it is per se right now. It's on Max, and so it's behind a subscription wall. But I will say shows like Snowfall, I know are popular. You've got your movies that I kind of grew up on, your Boys in the Hood, State Property, Belly, Above the Rim. You kind of go on and on. I don't know if those are really being made in the same way that I remember growing up, but I do think much of what we think about and hear about gang culture, and the music that kind of goes along with it has really been formed by those types of movies, those types of TV shows. I mentioned The Wire. If and I would encourage anybody, if you have access to it, to watch it. It is, as I said, I think it's some of the greatest TV work that's ever been done. But you can hear the soundtrack as the show progresses. There, kind of the music sort of ties in these moments throughout the show, and I think the same thing happens with some of those movies that I mentioned. I don't know if we do it as much anymore, but we used to have movie soundtracks. And those movie soundtracks would very much kind of tell the story of, you can kind of follow the story of the movie by listening to the soundtrack. You can get an idea of what's happening in the movie and in certain scenes because of what's happening with the soundtrack. And so I do think, maybe to a lesser extent these days, but I do know that it does feel like many of the perceptions and the ideas and sort of the framing that we have around gang culture and the music that kind of complements it is kind of rooted in some of those particular shows.
I think about one particular movie that I seen when I was an adolescent, the movie Colors. And when I'm being from New York, I was like, what is this?
Right.
There's a red and there's a blue side.
Right.
And I'll be honest with you, it placed a seed in me because I was like, what if that was going on in New York City?
Right.
What would that look like?
Right.
And then it ended up happening.
Right.
So I do see where the influence is very strong.
Yeah. I think kind of going back to that, when we have these types of conversations, I think it's so important to keep that backdrop in mind, because that in these really disadvantaged spaces where people are really, really struggling, where there's limited access to resources and barriers to kind of what we would generally call conventional society, it's not a stretch to kind of logically think, okay, well, there's not much to hold on to around the neighborhood, not much to hold on to in the classroom. But this movie feels real. Like, this movie speaks to what I'm experiencing, or this particular lyric to this particular song. That's what I experience on a day-to-day basis. And so, yeah, I absolutely think there is, we're I think we're sort of wired, the majority of human beings, to strive for something. And when one door closes, it's not a far stretch to say, okay, well, let me strive to something different, even if it's something that may be subcultural in some way, maybe not the conventional approach to striving or looking to aspire to something or attain something. But we're still striving. It just may be to something that conventional society might frown upon.
We talked about this a little bit off camera. Young Thug, a rapper, hip hop artist, who was recently released.
Right.
But his trial. Are you familiar with?
So
what
I know.
happened with him?
So I know a little bit about the. I know a little bit about the. I know some generalities about the trial. I know that his many of his rap lyrics became significant evidence for the prosecution throughout that process, and I think that's, as we kind of talked about, certainly continuing a process of what we're starting to see more often in our criminal courts, that rap lyrics are becoming sort of fodder for prosecutorial attorneys, district attorneys to kind of comb through to support certain charges or certain type of acts that a person might be alleged to have committed. So,
Yeah, which is I don't know how to feel about that, because you could be entertaining, or are you really telling the truth
Right.
about things that are going on?
Yeah, that's and I think that continues to be the sort of divergence. You have the many of the critics of it would say, hey, this is art that may be imitating life. It's representative of what people in really tough environments navigate and have to deal with on a regular basis. But that doesn't mean that because a lyric is being rapped or spoken, that it is somehow a confession or somehow indicative of some type of violent streak within a person. And so, yeah, that the many of the criticisms around it are certainly rooted in this idea that, hey, this type of music represents where I come from and what I've experienced and the things I've seen, even if it's not 100% accurate, even if 100% of the lyrics don't speak to a specific event, or I think in Young Thug's case, someone was killed, and that a part of the RICO charges against him, is kind of murder and drugs and things of that nature, were sort of attached to him in part because of some of what he talks about in his music. And so that's certainly something that he's probably the most high profile case that I know of. I think many of those early cases were people that I don't know the general public would know. And so I think his case in particular has gotten a lot of attention just because of his level of fame, certainly.
I have a question. Do you feel that the conscious effort in music is being pushed enough?
It does not seem like it to me. I do, the most recent, and I'm more, full disclosure, I am an old soul when it comes to music. In that small town I talked about, we had one radio station that we actually got consistently that I wanted to listen to. We had a lot of country music, a lot of rock music. Just that wasn't my thing growing up. So I kind of gravitated towards your soul and R&B and the Motown. So that's kind of my comfort place and comfort zone when it comes to music. But I will say, you know, to the extent that I'm aware, it doesn't seem so. So I got a few years ago when I was in graduate school, I got into to Chance the Rapper a good bit, and he kind of struck me as sort of the guy, or sort of one of those artists who, was trying to, even in kind of leaning into that art imitating life sort of lane. He also there was also, it seemed to be a certain level, or a certain hope for, or hope to empower, to be, prideful about being from Chicago, and I think that I have not seen that as much. As we kind of talked before, you don't really hear. I don't really hear as much from the Lupe fiascos. Kanye's sound has certainly changed, and who he was, and kind of how he rapped in those, first 3 albums or so is vastly different. Common is I feel like almost more of an actor now, and so it does feel like that there's an aspect of that missing, because it much of the music that I hear today feels like, there's your rap, I guess, that would be considered gangster rap. There's also kind of the lyrical rap that sounds like a mix between R&B and rap, but those feel different from the kind of conscious lane. So, but I'm open to being wrong there. I'm like I said, when I'm looking for something to listen to on a daily, I usually default towards, the Isley Brothers, or the Prince, or the Jackson 5, something Stevie Wonder, is something in that lane. So
Yeah. So when I think about the hip hop industry now,
mm-hmm.
In my opinion, it seems to be okay. If we talk about conscious music, is it going to sell?
Mm-hmm.
So we're putting this investment
Mm-hmm.
behind this artist, and how will we get our investment
Right,
back?
no question.
So to me, it's really based on the investment,
Right.
more than what the actual artist wants to
Mm-hmm.
promote himself.
Yeah, I think that's, unfortunately, that's probably going to be the case across most aspects of society. Like, we're looking to generally maximize profit. If we start a business, or if we start a record label, or put an album out, you want to make money at some point. Not you want to do the art, but you want to get some, you want to see some kind of return. And I don't know, I'd be interested to know kind of what, record label executives see in data. But my guess maybe that it only connects with a certain segment of the population. I do think one of one of those things that makes, kind of your specific gangster rap a bit more attractive, is because it appeals in a I think in a much broader way to the experiences of so many people, and sometimes I think the conscious rap is kind of calling people to something a little bit higher. Like, even if if you're in these kind of negative environments and disadvantaged neighborhoods and communities, that particular lane is often like, but hey, let's be prideful about what we have, and let's not forget about the community, and so it. And I think in kind of keeping with that backdrop of inequality and disadvantage, I don't think that is always visible. Like that kind of aspirational pipeline or pathway may feel farther away than, okay, I can go pick up a gun and get some status, get a rep, or up my status or up my rep, or get involved in the drug trade and make some money. And so I think one is much more, maybe feels more practical, or something that people, kids can touch more, and one feels like, okay, like I gotta be a bit more aspirational in this regard. So I would my guess is record execs are probably thinking something along those lines.
Yeah. I have a question a bit more about what you do.
Hmm.
And what would you say is the main thing that drove you to the work that you
Yeah.
study in criminology and
Okay.
criminal justice?
So as I mentioned, I'm from Mississippi, and as I was going through grad school, I was really thinking about, okay, well, what do I want to study? Like, what do I, when you go to grad school, the $1 million question is like, okay, well, how do you distinguish yourself as a scholar? Like, who are you as a scholar? And I struggled with it for a time, and then around 2013, 2014, I was sort of just, I kind of keep tabs on Mississippi. It's home, and I love it. I love it as a place, and I think it gets a very bad rap in the larger conversation. And so it's always been a place that's near and dear to me. So I keep up with what's going on in the state. And so in a few school districts around the state, the Department of Justice, Department of Education had to come in and essentially take over those schools, because kids were being suspended out of schools for really minor infractions. So passing gas in class, the wrong color uniform. Maybe one student had a bladder control issue, and so she didn't have time. Like, she had, it hit her that she had to go to the bathroom, and she didn't have time to ask the teacher to leave. And so in all of those cases, they were treated as, kind of under this catch-all term of insubordination. And in some school districts, that can lead to suspension, expulsion. In one particular school district, kids were being sent to detentional facilities without where they did not have representation. Their parents weren't aware that they were being sent to these places. And so the Department of Justice and Department of Education came in and was like, hey, you can't treat these kids like this. Like, we can't, punishment and sanctions are one thing, but there has to be a process here. And, no kids should be going to a detention facility because they had the wrong color blue on, their polo was the wrong color blue. And so I just got really interested in kind of what was driving, not just in Mississippi, but broadly, because that's similar to some of the trends we've seen, trends and patterns we've seen throughout the country. And so I was really interested in kind of understanding what was driving that, but also kind of what could we do about it? Like, what are some protection factors that might, pull us back from the severe punishment and the really severe, student discipline. And so that's really where my interest in this particular student population started. Really, really organic, and really, kind of just thinking about my home state and thinking about the things that were happening there. And that kind of broadened out to just a more general interest in youth outcomes and the racial disparities within those outcomes, and the things that are driving them, and maybe some ways we can sort of diminish and alleviate some of that, some of those issues. Because as we talked about earlier, as when we're talking about adolescents, when we're talking about youth, their job is to go to school. Like, the expectation of kids is that they go to school. If they have a job, if they're of working age, it's supposed to work around school. Like, it's supposed to, maybe work on the weekends or a couple hours after school. And so generally in American society, we expect kids go to school, and then once you finish with high school, kind of figure out the next thing from there. And so the research really shows that when that doesn't work, because it's when students fail out of school or drop out of school or they're suspended out of school or expelled out of school, the research is really consistent that there are really very few positive outcomes that come down the line in the life course, because that schooling is so important during that time period, and so important for kind of what options are available moving forward, which, interestingly enough, could cycle back to, seeing gangs as being attractive. If school isn't working, then alternative paths are likely to be considered.
Interesting. So my other question is, what effect do you think discipline has on kids' self-esteem?
So school discipline, just discipline more broadly?
I would say
Broadly.
broadly.
Yeah, so I think there's some research out there that suggests that discipline is really important, but the type of discipline is more important. So there is a difference between there's some really cool research that looked at the difference between authoritative parenting and authoritarian parenting. Authoritarian parenting is what it sounds like. It's authoritarian. It's kind of my way or the highway. Maybe corporal punishment. Really strict and severe punishment. Authoritative, on the other hand, is it's establishing, like, hey, I'm in charge. A parent or a guardian saying, hey, I'm in charge here, or I'm the adult, you're the child. But also kind of making space for a child to have some agency in that process. Like, hey, maybe a parent saying, hey, I don't want you running the streets while I'm waiting while I'm still at work. Like, I want you to, my expectation while you wait for me to come home from work is to go to an after school program, or if you're a stoop kid, to hang out on the stoop and wait. Or if you're, a latchkey kid, use that key, get inside, don't open the door for, so very authoritative parenting or authoritative discipline is, laid out. It's there's an order and a rationale behind it, whereas authoritarian discipline is much more in line with what we think of when we think of authoritarian leaders in different countries that are very, ruling with an iron fist and very my way or the highway. And so I think in those authoritarian instances, I'm sure kids are thinking, like, this person, whether parent, guardian, teacher, this person doesn't really care about me. They're just telling me what to do. The idea behind the authoritative parenting is that there is a clear distinction between, adult and youth, or adult and child, but also there's a treating of the child with a level of respect, a level of decency that we don't often see with that more of authoritarian model. So certainly I could imagine any kid that has been the recipient of that authoritarian discipline, it makes a lot of sense. It kind of logically follows that they would probably rebel against that. They would look for other places and other avenues of their life to kind of exercise some freedom, because they can't exercise it in that particular classroom or in that particular home. And so it certainly, I can certainly see how that difference would impact how the choices that a kid might make, the people that they might hang out with, and the things that might be appealing to them versus someone who maybe is in that other category.
Yeah, I find it really important to allow your children to have a voice.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a parent,
Mm-hmm.
and what I did as a father, I wanted to meet
Mm-hmm.
my children's friends.
Right.
I went a step further and even built a program.
Okay.
Because they like to play basketball,
Right,
and I
right,
said,
right.
well, let's do this together.
Right, right.
So I do feel like uh, hearing from your children, making sure that they know that they have a voice,
Right.
that you're able to respect them in that space, and because when you have outsiders talking to your children, they may give that respect that the child is looking for.
Right, no question. So my wife and I, we just had a daughter a year ago. So she's a little bit over a year, and it is, we're already trying to, if she throws a tantrum, like, let her throw a tantrum. It's not hurting anybody. It's her expressing herself because she can't use her words yet. And so we're trying to as we go to kind of find that balance between, being authoritative and being, a good parent and a mindful parent, watchful, but also leaving space for her personality, her individuality, all of the things that are going to make her special. Allowing space for those things to come to the surface.
I do have a question about discipline in the school.
Okay.
Have you observed over discipline of black kids during school, or racial encounters?
Right. Absolutely. So the research suggests that students of color are 2 to 3 times more likely to be suspended, expelled, much more likely to receive a suspension for a first infraction, and this is generally compared to white students. So there's certainly racial disparities throughout discipline, very similar to what we see in the adult criminal justice system. There's work that highlights the imprisonment penalty that defendants of color often pay in the justice system, and we see something very, very similar in schools as well. And so it is. I've done some work looking at. I mentioned, kind of part of my interest in the subject was, kind of, okay, we know it's a problem. We know this is an issue. How can it potentially be alleviated some, or how can we diminish these really negative impacts of really severe student punishment? And one thing that in some of the work I found is that teacher race is really important. Having a teacher, having a coach who, looks like a student, who identifies with the background of a student, you can often speak to, very similar to how we think rap lyrics speak to certain certain kids, because it lines up with their experiences. It's one thing to have for speaking, as a man, it was different when I had a male teacher. Like it was not in a love, nothing against the women teachers that I had, but there was a connection, I think, with some male teachers that went, I think, a little bit deeper, or at least there was a bit of a realization that, okay, like, this guy knows what I'm feeling right now. This guy's been in my shoes. He's probably not telling me this to make me upset, or to be a stickler. That there's maybe some value in what's being communicated, and so my research does suggest that there is a kind of protection that comes from having teachers and administrators and counselors that can really understand and identify and empathize with what students are experiencing. I feel lucky every day that I did not grow up in the time that students now grow up in. I grew up in a time before social media. I was in college before Facebook was a thing. and 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 so there was often space for me to kind of figure things out, and there was space for the teachers in my life, the adults at church to really allow me to mess up, but also kind of put me on a solid path forward. And I know kids these days have so many concerns. We kind of referenced the pandemic, social media. It is as someone who's going to have to deal with it with our daughter. It keeps me up at night because it is so different than the childhood I had. And so um I I do think that it is important to kind of highlight the things that seem to matter for those disciplinary disparities, those racial and ethnic disparities. We also see some gender disparities I should reference as well. You're much more likely to see girls be Monique Morris has a great book called Push Out, and she kind of talks about how young girls are kind of funneled out of the classroom, and some of the the overarching consequences of that. And so it just a far. I'm sorry, I get to rambling a little bit when I talk about that particular topic. But yeah, we see those disparities. But the good news is we do see research does suggest that there are some things that can sort of blunt the negative impact of that discipline, that severe discipline in schools.
I wanted to double back on the music industry. So we talked about the issues and the influence of music, but how could we utilize these platforms to promote gang prevention?
Yeah.
Is there a certain artist that does this in a positive way that you can think of?
Think of off the top of my head. In kind of thinking about the question a bit ahead of time, I think it's just really important to be open to a lot of creative outlets, whether that's music or art. One person you all have talked to, Dr. Yasser Payne, who was in our department. He goes into the inner city and teaches people how to do research. Like that's his thing. And so not only are they collecting data from often people who are a population that's often difficult to reach, they're also learning not only more about their communities, their neighborhoods, they're also learning more about themselves. And so I would say his work, I was, yeah, and I think he's a bit of an artist himself from what I remember. So I know that's local. But his work is as I'm talking kind of comes front and center because I think it prioritizes the community, the people in the community. You don't have he creates an environment where you're not having outsiders kind of come in and lecture to people or just kind of plop in to get some data and head out. It's really a comprehensive process where not only is the community being empowered, but also the people who are learning how to do professional level research, college level research. They're also being empowered as well with strategies and techniques that they can take into all types of context, but also make sense of their own reality and make sense of what they've experienced and what their communities continue to experience.
Yeah, I agree. Back to your line of work.
Okay.
What have you witnessed or heard regarding the influence of youth joining gangs?
So it's I think just is kind of keeping in mind that it's against a back, it's often against a backdrop of lack and inadequacy, or inadequate resources, inadequate, home life. Generally is going to be, I think gang life, gang membership kind of serves as it kind of feels a need in many instances. It could be, it could be protection. It could be like, hey, like I don't feel safe in my neighborhood. I don't want to get jumped. If I do get jumped, I want to have people who are going to have my back. It could be just that simple. If it's combined with, some type of illegal economy like the drug trade, could be financial gain. It could be, at a very, very basic level, it could be a search for family, a search for belonging. If a person is growing up in a home, one thing that we see really consistently across criminological research is that parental socialization, attachment to family, what we learn in our family interactions and home life is really, really impactful for how we behave and what the rest of our life course kind of looks like. And so gang membership could serve as sort of a stand-in when there isn't a warm and loving, family life or home life. So it could be a host of options, or a host of pulls or pushes that get people to that decision. But the major, at least what I think one major takeaway always has to be that this is what happens, or this is what can happen when people don't have the resources that they need, when people are struggling in poverty, don't see a pathway into conventional society, into middle class life, or middle class America. When people feel trapped and confined to really adverse environments, then again, things that may not appeal to the person that goes and works in downtown Wilmington from 9 to 5 would appeal to someone who doesn't see a lot of options, a lot of resources around them. Whether it's protection, safety, family, financial gain. We talk a lot in my classes about, certainly when we talk about The Wire, we talk about status and reputation. If there is no, when there's not access to real economic currency, we find other things to kind of serve as a sort of a replacement currency. And so maybe you don't have a lot of money in your pocket, but maybe you're the toughest in the neighborhood. Like that can count for something. Or you're the person who is thought of as, like, hey, you don't mess with that person. That's, that can sort of serve as its own type of currency, in sort of this upside down world that a lot of kids find themselves in.
I identify with that. Growing up in my neighborhood, the drug dealers were from other cultures, and it just bullied the neighborhood. And the only respect that I seen they had was for certain gang members.
Right.
And because of that, I found myself wanting to befriend
Right.
those certain reputations.
Right.
And in some instances, it protected my younger brother, my younger sister, because they knew, okay, they're protected by this group,
right?
And we don't want that kind of beef.
Right.
So I identify with that. I thank you for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So last question.
Okay.
If there was one key takeaway you'd want our listeners to gain from our conversation, what would that be?
So, and then I've sort of come back to it several times, but I do, I think it's important, and I tell my students in class this as well, that human beings don't exist in vacuums. Like we don't exist. We're not kind of, plopped down. We're not kind of pulled out of our own families, our own schools, our own neighborhoods, and just expected to go and thrive and succeed and things of that nature. We're all products of our environment, and the most impoverished places in our country, and even, you can even argue some of the more impoverished places on earth, when there's a lack of resources and barriers to what we generally hold up as success, whatever that looks like, whether that's a nice house with a white picket fence, or a really nice car, or a six-figure job, whatever we identify as success. When there are barriers to that, and not barriers in the sense that a kid just isn't interested in those things, but legitimately attending a school where we can't have school because the heat doesn't work when it's too cold, or the air conditioning is inadequate when it's too hot. I think we have to always remember that kids are often are a function of their environment, and the choices that we make as individuals sometimes are a function of that, or a function of the places we come from. And so that's in part why I believe so much of rap culture, and certainly gangster rap, is appealing to, it's not that a kid says, hey, most kids don't, at 3, most kids aren't like, oh, I want to be a gangster rapper. Like, at some point, they are connecting the dots that, well, this sounds like what I'm experiencing on a day-to-day basis. This speaks to the anger or the negative emotion, the anxiety inside of me. And most importantly, when when a lot of the barriers to kind of conventional society are unavailable, or perceived as unavailable, it's not a bad, I understand how a person says, okay, well, the rap game might do it. Like, it not only would, help my rep around the community, but it also might be a way out, and a way into more of, middle class life, or upper class life. And so yeah, I that's the prism through which I really see the world and see life, is that we're functions of, or products of our environments. We're products of the people that pour into us or don't. We're products of the teachers that show us value, that value us or don't. And the choices that we often make can be impacted, or are often going to be impacted by the places we come from, where we go to school, what mom or dad pours into us or doesn't, and also just what we see as available. And I don't think people often understand, like, unless you lived in a really, really impoverished place, a really, really impoverished area and environment, I don't know if the general population understands just how isolating and how segregated that can feel. And as a result, what seem like not smart choices, or choices that we wouldn't make, become very easy choices, or very logical choices, once you think about that context that often surrounds a person.
I really appreciate this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you all for having me.
Hopefully we can work together at some point in the community.
That'd be great.
Thank you. We hope you found this episode informative. I look forward to continuing the conversation next week on gang culture. Stay tuned as we dive into an enlightening conversation with our guests.